The house on Loring Avenue in Westwood had once belonged to Leonard Nimoy. A charming traditional-style home built in 1938, it had stood quietly for decades, its walls absorbing the echoes of one of Hollywood's most beloved icons. When Nimoy passed in 2015, his legacy lived on. But his house changed hands, eventually landing in the possession of a young couple, Daniel and Emily Carter. They hadn't known much about the home's history when they bought it. The real estate agent had mentioned that the previous owner was a well-known actor, but it wasn't until Emily did a little research that she discovered the truth. "Spock lived here," she had whispered to Daniel one night, her fingers tracing an old black and white photo she found online. At first, the house was everything they had hoped for: spacious but cozy, elegant but comfortable. The wooden floors creaked pleasantly, the high ceilings gave an airy feel, and the private study, once Leonard's sanctuary, had a beautiful window that let in golden afternoon light. But as they settled in, little things began to happen. It started with the books. Daniel, a professor of physics, had a habit of organizing his books meticulously. He'd arranged them neatly in the study's built-in shelves, yet every morning, a different book would be slightly pulled out. At first, he assumed it was Emily, or maybe the house shifting, but the oddness persisted. One evening, he slid a book, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, back into place and turned to leave. A soft shuffling sound behind him made him pause. When he turned back, the book was sticking out again. Emily, too, felt it. She'd wake in the night to faint murmurs, like a voice speaking just beyond the range of understanding. Once, while standing in the kitchen, she distinctly heard a low chuckle, warm, amused, but undeniably present. Then came the train. One evening, while sorting through some old storage boxes left behind in the attic, Emily found a small, vintage toy train. It was well-kept, polished, and elegant, with a tiny inscription on the bottom: "Happy birthday, Leonard. Love, Susan." She smiled and showed it to Daniel, who set it on a shelf in the study as a small tribute. That night, they woke to the faint sound of wheels turning. They followed the noise downstairs, and there, in the dim glow of the hallway light, the toy train was moving on its own, circling an invisible track on the hardwood floor. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched as it rolled in slow, deliberate loops before coming to a gentle stop. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Okay, that's interesting." Emily turned to him, her face pale but calm. "Do you think it's him?" Daniel swallowed, then nodded toward the train. "If it is, I think he's just saying hello." From that night on, the house never felt empty. The strange occurrences continued, books shifting, lights flickering softly in the study, the scent of cigar smoke drifting through the hallway, though neither of them smoked. But none of it felt sinister. If anything, it felt like an old presence, lingering not out of malice, but of love. Leonard Nimoy had always been a storyteller, an artist, a thinker. Perhaps some part of him had chosen to remain in the house that had once been his sanctuary, his place of quiet reflection. And as long as the Carters lived there, they welcomed him, treating the unseen presence with the same respect they would a houseguest. And every so often, when the nights were especially still, the little train would roll forward, making its gentle circles in the dark. The weeks passed in quiet unease. Neither Daniel nor Emily spoke openly about the strange occurrences, yet both felt them in the stillness of the house, in the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long in the corners of rooms, in the way certain spots, especially the study, held a warmth that did not belong to the changing seasons. The train, though, remained the most inexplicable thing. It didn't move every night. Sometimes weeks would pass without a sound, and Daniel would start to convince himself that there was a rational explanation. Perhaps the floorboards weren't as even as they seemed, or maybe there was some kind of draft pushing the train just enough to send its tiny wheels rolling. He had tried to test it once, kneeling down and nudging it ever so slightly with his finger. The wheels resisted at first, then moved jerky, uneven. Nothing like the smooth, deliberate circles they had witnessed that night. One evening, he left a notepad beside the train with a simple question scrawled in blue ink: "Who are you?" The next morning, the notepad remained untouched. The train sat motionless in its usual place. No response, no movement, just silence. And yet, there was something. When Daniel picked up the notepad, his fingers brushed against the paper, and a deep chill ran up his arm. Not the kind that came from a drafty house in the early hours of the morning, but something else. Something that reached beneath the skin. He exhaled, staring at the blank page. There was no answer, no ghostly handwriting scrawled in the night. But in that moment, he knew without question that something had read the words. Emily felt it too, though in a different way. She had always been the more intuitive of the two. While Daniel sought logic and patterns, Emily moved with instinct, sensing the unseen currents in the world around her. She noticed the way the house held its breath at certain times of day, especially in the late afternoon, when the golden light spilled through the study window and cast long, slanted rays across the wooden floor. That was when she felt the presence the most. It wasn't frightening, not in the way one might expect. There were no sudden bangs, no whispered threats, no icy fingers trailing over her skin. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of something unfinished, something waiting. One afternoon, she stood in the study, her hands resting lightly on the desk, the same desk where Leonard Nimoy had once sat, where he had once written, once thought, once dreamed. The surface was smooth, polished from years of use, though here and there, tiny imperfections remained. Faint scratches, a small dent near the corner, the remnants of a life lived fully. She closed her eyes, breathing in the air dusty warm, tinged with the faintest scent of something she couldn't quite place. Not wood, not old paper, something richer, deeper. A scent that did not belong to the house as it was now, but to the house as it had been. Then, just as the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the window frame, she heard it. A whisper. Not words. Not really. More like the memory of words, something just beyond the threshold of understanding. A soft murmur, warm and familiar, curling around her like the pages of a well-loved book. Emily opened her eyes. The study was empty, and yet, she had never felt less alone. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. That evening, Emily said nothing to Daniel about what had happened in the study. Not because she was afraid he wouldn't believe her, she knew he would, but because she wanted to hold on to the moment a little longer, to let it settle inside her like dust floating through a sunbeam. She sat across from him at the dining table, pushing her food around her plate, barely hearing the soft clinking of his fork against ceramic. Daniel, for his part, was preoccupied as well. He had spent the better part of the day in his office at the university, but his mind had been back at the house, circling around the empty notepad and the way the air had felt charged when he touched it. He had spent years teaching physics, grounding himself in the measurable, the observable, the definable. And yet, he looked up, realizing Emily had said something. "What?" he asked, blinking himself back into the present. "I said, do you ever feel like the house is watching?" Her voice was careful, testing the words as she spoke them. Daniel hesitated before answering, unsure if she meant it in the way he thought she did. "You mean like haunted?" Emily tilted her head slightly, considering. "Not haunted. Not in a bad way. Just aware." Daniel exhaled, setting his fork down. He could have dismissed it, could have laughed it off, but they were past that now. "Yeah," he admitted. "I feel it too." A pause. The house hummed quietly around them, the low, ambient creaks of old wood settling into the coolness of the evening. Emily shifted in her chair, crossing her arms. "I heard something in the study today. Not words exactly. More like the idea of words." Daniel studied her carefully. "What did it sound like?" She looked down at her hands. "Familiar." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The wind moved gently outside, rustling the bougainvillea along the patio. It was strange how quickly they had both accepted this, how little resistance they had put up against the idea that something remained in the house with them. Not something malicious, not something frightening, but something that lingered. And yet, even as Emily felt comforted by its presence, Daniel felt something else entirely. He hadn't told her about the dream. It had started 2 nights ago, in the hours just before dawn. In the dream, Daniel was standing in the study, but it wasn't as it was now. The air smelled different, richer, heavier, laced with the faintest trace of cigar smoke. The walls were lined with books he didn't recognize, their spines cracked with age. A soft, golden light filtered through the window, casting warm shadows across the desk. And then, the figure, not clear, not solid, but there, presence barely out of reach. It wasn't facing him. It stood by the bookshelf, fingers trailing along the leather-bound spines as though searching for something lost. Daniel tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The figure turned slightly, not fully, just enough for Daniel to see the outline of a face in the dim light. A profile, half-formed, strong features softened by time, eyes thoughtful, distant. Daniel wanted to step forward, wanted to close the space between them, but something held him back. A feeling, an understanding. Then, just before he woke, the figure finally spoke. Only 2 words. Low, gentle, certain. Not yet. He hadn't told Emily about it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what it meant. Not yet. The words played over and over in his mind, circling like the little toy train on the hardwood floor. Not a warning, not a threat, just a statement, plain and unwavering. What wasn't ready? What was still waiting? And why, despite everything he knew about the rational world, did Daniel feel that, whatever it was, he and Emily were a part of it now? That night, the wind picked up, rolling through the narrow streets of Westwood and rattling the old window panes. The house groaned softly in its sleep, its wooden bones shifting under the pressure of time. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the deep, rhythmic breaths of Daniel beside her. She could tell he was restless, even in sleep, his breathing uneven, his fingers twitching slightly against the sheets. She turned onto her side, tucking the blanket under her chin. Outside, the moon cast long silver streaks across the bedroom floor, illuminating the worn edges of the furniture, the framed pictures on the wall. For the first time since they had moved in, the house felt impossibly vast, as though it stretched far beyond its physical boundaries, as though its history had unfolded all at once, layering over itself in unseen currents. And then, a sound, soft, subtle, the distant shuffle of paper. Emily sat up slowly, careful not to wake Daniel. She held her breath, listening. The house was quiet again, but the feeling remained, the sensation of something just beyond sight, of movement in the air, of a presence waiting. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet pressing into the cool hardwood floor. The study. She knew before she even reached the door. That was where it was coming from. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside. The study door was ajar, just as they had left it. But something felt different now, charged, like the air before a storm. Emily stepped forward, her fingertips trailing against the wall as she moved. She hesitated at the threshold. The room was exactly as it had been, Daniel's books stacked neatly on the shelves, the small train still perched on the side table. But the window, which had been closed when they went to bed, was now open just an inch, the night air creeping in, carrying the scent of damp earth and bougainvillea. And on the desk, something that hadn't been there before. A single sheet of paper. Emily swallowed, her pulse quickening as she stepped closer. The edges of the paper curled slightly, as if touched by unseen fingers. There was writing on it, not typed, not printed, but written by hand in dark, slanted script. Her breath caught. The ink was still drying. And the words, not yet. Emily's hands trembled as she picked up the page, her mind racing, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She turned sharply, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, half expecting to feel the warmth of breath against her skin. But the room was empty. Only the sound of the wind outside. Only the stillness of the house, watching, waiting. The words burned in her mind, in her hands. Not yet, not yet. Something was coming. Something unfinished. And they were in the middle of it now. Emily stood motionless in the dim glow of the study, her fingers tightening around the paper. The ink shimmered slightly in the weak light, as if it had only just been written. But there was no pen, no presence, no sign that anyone or anything had touched the desk since she and Daniel had gone to bed. A gust of wind whispered through the slightly open window, lifting the edges of the paper in her hands. She could smell the night cool, damp, tinged with the sweetness of the bougainvillea outside. But underneath it, something else lingered. A scent barely there, almost imperceptible. Smoke. Not the acrid bite of a house fire, nor the stale stench of something long burned. No, this was warm, rich, familiar. The scent of a well-worn habit. The scent of old cigars. Emily turned her head sharply, scanning the room, but there was nothing. No movement. No shift in shadow. Just the steady hum of the house, the faint creak of old beams settling deeper into the night. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. The words on the paper seemed to pulse, as if the ink had sunk into the very fibers of the page, imprinting something deeper than language. Not yet. The same words from Daniel's dream. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the message, her mind circling uselessly around the impossibility of it. Minutes? Longer? She might have stayed frozen like that if not for the soft creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Her breath caught. Emily turned. The house was still. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding something in, waiting for something to be acknowledged. And then another sound, the faintest shift of movement. Not in the hallway, not upstairs. From the study closet. Emily's pulse pounded against her ribs. The closet door was shut, just as it had always been. A simple wooden door with a brass handle dulled by time. She had never paid much attention to it before. It was just storage, half filled with books Daniel had yet to organize. But now, standing there in the hush of the study, with the weight of unseen eyes pressing into her skin, the door felt different. Felt wrong. Like it didn't quite belong to the rest of the house. Like it was waiting to be opened. Emily took a slow, measured step forward, the paper still clutched in her hands. The floor groaned softly beneath her weight, the sound swallowed quickly by the stillness. She hesitated for only a second before reaching out, fingers brushing against the cool brass of the handle. And then, she turned it. The door swung open. Darkness. But not the flat, empty kind of darkness that filled a simple, forgotten closet. This was something deeper, something that seemed to stretch past the physical boundaries of the small space. The air inside was heavier, thicker. The scent of paper and dust mixed with something else. Something older. Emily took a step closer, her heart hammering, her breath tight in her chest. And then she saw it. The box. It sat neatly on the floor, pushed against the back wall of the closet, tucked into the shadows as if it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for someone to find it. A simple wooden box, unmarked, unassuming. But Emily knew without question, without reason, that this was why she had woken. This was what the house wanted her to see. She knelt slowly, reaching out, fingers brushing the rough wood. The moment she touched it, a whisper curled through the room, low, fleeting, just at the edge of hearing. A voice, and for the first time she could understand the words. Open it. Emily's breath shuddered out of her lungs. She hesitated only a moment before she slid the box from the closet, pulling it into the golden spill of lamplight. The wood was old, smooth beneath her hands, the kind of aged wood that darkened over time, that had been touched and carried and held by hands long gone. The lid was fastened with a small, simple latch. No lock, no key. She swallowed hard. And then, she opened it. The lid creaked softly as it lifted, the hinges stiff with age. Inside, Emily frowned. Not what she expected. No letters, no photographs, no obvious sign of something personal or significant. Just papers, neatly stacked, yellowed at the edges, curled slightly from time and air. Emily reached in, fingertips brushing the top page, and lifted it carefully into the light. And that was when she saw it. Her breath caught. The handwriting. Slanted. Sharp. Familiar. She had seen it only minutes ago. Freshly inked on the paper left on the desk. It was his. Leonard Nimoy's. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced back at the open closet, at the shadows stretching deep against the far wall. The house had been waiting for them. For her. For this. And now she was holding something that was never meant to be found. Emily's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, her breath shallow. The documents were letters personal, unfinished. Some addressed to old colleagues, others to family. But one stood out from the rest. It was a single sheet, separate from the others, its ink darker, fresher. She read the words slowly. Not yet, but soon. A chill ran through her, deeper than fear and understanding. Leonard Nimoy had left something behind. Not just papers, not just memories, but an intention. A message that had never been delivered. A final thought, lingering in the spaces between the past and the present, waiting for someone to find it. And she had. The air in the study shifted lighter now, the pressure in the room lifting as if an unseen presence had finally exhaled. The scent of cigar smoke faded, replaced by nothing but the crisp, night-cooled air drifting in through the open window. Emily looked up. The house was quiet. The waiting was over. She didn't know how, but she knew somewhere, in some way beyond understanding, Leonard Nimoy was finally at peace. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.